The Japanese buy my redwoods and they pay me off in yen. And as for compensation, they teach me how to sit zazen. They all say it'll be okay, but they don't all say when. As I'm singing my time down to the tune. Now these eyes of mine have become resigned, that what they see is what they get. But my heart ain't tame, you better know my brain, it ain't nobody's pet. And we all must die, and that is why there ain't no time to fret. As I'm singing my time down to the tune. As I'm singing my time down to the tune.
Yeah.
That's why I have to write shit down, because
Stand up.
Hello, my friends. I am back here on Stand Up, back home with my family, back in the shed, talking to you after the road trip to Utah and Northern California, where I met and hung out with listener friends, stayed at Peter Coyote's house. Amazing trip. So great to finally meet Pete Co, Jim Babowski, Joby Tapia, and Dustin Barnett. Or is it Tapia, Joby? He'll correct me. And we all hung out on Monday night. I stayed at Jim's house, and now we have a text chat, the San Francisco boys. The San Francisco boys. If you were up there and I didn't get to meet up with you, I will be back. So don't have any FOMO. I'll get to Southern California, and I am determined to get to all over the country to meet and hang out with folks who listen to this show, because if it is anything like the time that we had together in Northern California over the past few days, then we're in for a treat. It was so much fun. We hung out on Monday night, and then on Tuesday we went for a hike. Jim and I, Joby took us for a hike up Mount Tamalpais. I guess they just call it Mount Tam. Anyway, we climbed 2,000 feet, and it was hard, and there were different points where I thought Joby was trying to kill Jim and I, but Jim was in good shape, Joby's in amazing shape, and I got the bronze, but we kept up, and I didn't die, and it was just triumphant and fun, and what a way to spend a day. Thank you to all those guys who really showed me a good time out there. So it's Wednesday night. I've just gotten back, and on Thursday, tomorrow, I'll have a great recap of the midterm elections where I'm going to do 10 minutes with a whole bunch of your favorite guests. Still trying to book them and see who it's going to be, but look for that on Thursday. Quick hits with 5 or 6 or maybe even more of your favorite guests here on Stand Up in the midterm elections. But today, a very special guest because I stayed at his house. I think you're really going to get a lot out of my conversation today with actor, writer, poet, Buddhist, priest, legendary voiceover artist, friend, mentor, and teacher. Peter Coyote joins me today. Of course, I was out to Northern California, stayed at his home on Sunday night, spent the night and most of the next day with him. Tried to record a conversation that touched on much of what we discussed while we were hanging out, and as you can see, I got him to pull his guitar out, play a few of his originals for us, too. More at the end of our interview that you're really going to love. And if you join me at tomorrow night's hangout, I'll tell you all kinds of stories, because every moment there was just another moment in story. It was just such a surreal thing to be at his home and listening to him, being around him, walking his dogs and meeting his neighbors and watching him just operate, take phone calls and be kind and generous to people who needed him. It's just a special and unique guy. We had an awesome time. He couldn't have been kinder and more generous to me. We went out and meditated in his Zen meditation shed, his Zendo. He made me dinner. He took me to lunch. We talked about politics and life. He gave me advice on my marriage and parenting. and it was just wonderful. And so I convinced him to sit down and let me film our conversation as well as tape audio record it here. And so I'll post a lot of the videos up for you on all of my social media as well as youtube.com/standup along with him singing. But let's get into it right now. My very special conversation that took place at Peter Coyote's home and in his dining room with a roaring wood fire behind him. It just couldn't have been more perfect. I hope you like it. Gets pretty serious. We have some minor disagreements about politics, but then we switch gears about halfway through and talk about life. So I hope that you listen to the whole thing. It really meant a lot to me. And, you know, some of the stuff, I've asked him this stuff before. I should do better to ask him different questions so we don't go over stuff that he's weighed in upon. But it doesn't even matter because he is one of the greatest voices in all of the land. So it's so wonderful just to be with him talking about anything. I just remember at one point, I can't do an impression who can of Peter Coyote, but he just, in the middle of an important conversation, he just goes, "Do you want a peanut butter cookie? I'm getting a peanut butter cookie." I just started laughing. He goes, "I told you I had an attention deficiency problem." Just so great. So great. So let's get it started. I started wherever he wanted to start it. I just hit record and, well, we were off. Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Coyote in his own natural habitat.
Well, I'll tell you, I thought of something to talk about.
You did?
Yeah, that's really actually on my mind. So I'm 81 years old. I've been involved seriously in politics, seriously engaged in politics since I was 14 years old, working on the Adlai-Stevenson campaign. And very much involved all the way through the 60s, civil rights, counterculture, worked for the governor of California for 8 years, made a big success running a state agency for him. I've seen the sausage being made. I've seen fistfights taking place backstage when Prop 13 passed and legislators were beating the crap out of each other. And now I'm sitting here on the eve of an election where 120 members of Congress are breaking their oath to the Constitution and refusing to certify an election, where 297 election deniers are running for office of Secretary of State, something like that, election stuff, and where concerted programs are being run in broad daylight about how to subvert and take over, where the governor of Michigan, a guy who wants to be governor of Michigan, says, if I'm governor, Democrats will never win another election. And at least 70 million Americans think that's okay. So what I'm seeing is the country is roughly cut in half, and the two sides are roughly equal in power. And because a very small change in the vote, 1 or 2%, can transmit 100% of the power to one party or another, there's no inducement to change your programs to be more popular. When the Republicans lose, instead of changing and trying to say, well, the voters don't like what we're selling, they say, let's just keep on, let's just figure out what people want to hear, we'll check for buzzwords, and we might win it all. So if they win it all this time, they've already gerrymandered so many states where they can rule as a permanent minority with no regard for the voters. Right. So now I'm 81 years old, and I'm living on my little farm, and I'm looking at the very real possibility of living in a fascist state, an authoritarian state, where the people are disenfranchised. And I'm thinking to myself, what am I going to do? Am I going to stay here and spend the rest of my life in some kind of isolation? I'm not going to shut up, but I have a long lefty track record. Could not be safe for me, particularly to be here. Or do I move? Do I let these sons of bitches run me out of my country and move someplace so that I can be a Zen priest, so I can continue to work until such a time as I either die or as either the country takes democracy and civil liberties and things seriously? And that's a real question to me. And I don't know yet which way I'm going to come down on it.
I'm surprised to hear you say that because I don't know. Do you think it gets that bad that they send out the squads to root people out who are effective or influential? Because when I look at your home here, it's a dream. It's everything you could want here on this little space and in this house. The idea of leaving it is so daunting. And, you know, we go for a walk and you meet all your neighbors and you know everybody. And I guess what I feel is that no matter what happens, we're still going to have our communities. We're still going to be able to communicate with each other, including the way that we are now to, you know, other people. I said yesterday, as long as the grid is still up, the internet still works, and I know how to work the microphone, we'll continue to connect and we'll figure things out in this new paradigm that we're in.
Who's the we that you're referring to?
Those of us who, I mean, all of us, including those on the right, including people who support we'll still be able to, I think, get around and communicate. I feel like it's not going to get so bad, I guess.
Well, my Jewish relatives who felt that way about Germany are all dead.
Right.
22 of them. And I just found out last month that my grandmother's sister, husband, and children were executed in Poland near the beginning of the war when they were still shooting Jews to death. They shot 2 million just shooting them into ditches. So I don't know if you saw those targets outside, those pistol targets with the bullseyes blown out. But I'm a competitive pistol shooter, and I practice, and I grew up reloading and hunting, and I stopped hunting when I became a Buddhist priest. But I know guns inside and out, and I don't fetishize them, but always like them. I like the machinery of them. But I'm also a Jew, and if they show up at my house, I'm going to shoot somebody. There's just no two ways about it. I'll take the karma of being a murderer, but I'm not going to be a victim.
Right.
And the lesson to me is clear, and the parallels between the United States right now and Germany in 1937 are just graphically clear. And so who would gamble on human nature? They talk about the 6 million Jews killed, but there were 12 million people killed. There were 6 million Jews, but there was another 6 million gypsies, homosexuals, socialists, Catholics, renegades, anyone to the nation. So the figure is 12 million. So once you've posited a universe where 12 million people can be obliterated by all the power of the state, you can't deny your imagination the possibility that it could happen again. It was the most civilized country in Europe. It was the home of Mozart and Wagner and Mendelssohn and Handel and Bach, and 12 million people were exterminated while the good citizens did fuck all. So when I look at these chesty motherfuckers out intimidating people in the voting booths or at the drop boxes or something like that, I pray to God I don't run into one of them because I will lose it. I will lose it, and I will hurt them before they hurt me. And so understanding that about myself, I think, where am I going to continue to live? Am I going to live in a place where I'm just as apt to be exposed to that as not? Or am I going to live in a place where the odds are people have solved the problem of living together?
Well, hold on a second. Because when you wake up in the morning, you've told me that you think about who you want to assassinate, but then you meditate. And I had the great honor and privilege of doing that with you today, and I want to talk about that. But because you do that, doesn't that help you as you go about your day? And if you run into one of these people, don't you go back to your practice, or do you think you snap?
Well, I don't know, but I have a deep karmic resentment about bullies.
Yeah, same.
Yeah. And it's one of the places where I'm not exactly trustworthy and reliable. When I run into a bully terrifying someone else or terrifying me, I'm actually a dangerous person. So I just don't know, to be honest. I don't lose my temper much. I've done 45 years of meditating and work, and I'm pretty housebroken. But I look at these guys planning to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, bursting into the State House with their flak jackets and their AK-47s.
Yeah.
They're bullies. They're intimidating people. And I would rather be shot fighting them than I would sit by and do nothing.
We have talked about what you think makes them that way.
Well, look, the universe is half positive and half negative. There's every possibility of everything in the universe. So within the spectrum of human beings, there's every possibility, from cannibalism to Mother Teresa. So we can say it's a bad childhood. We know that monkeys that are bad, raised by bad mothers, become bad mothers. But that doesn't affect the cure. We also know that 20% of the population are sociopaths. They don't suffer guilt and remorse or shame. So I don't actually care what makes them that way. I'm actually concerned with what's happening in this present moment. Who are you manifesting? Who are you wanting to be? And if you're trying to make me do something I don't want to, or make somebody else do something I don't want to, I'm not going to just stand around and witness.
Right. What do you think of the rise of anti-Semitism over the last few years, especially over the last few months? Have you been paying attention to that?
I'd say so, yeah. It's just been condoned. It's always been here. You know, they lynched Leo Frank in the South for being a Jew back in the 30s. It's always been here, but it's never been condoned by a president.
Right.
And all these guys who are out, the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys and the militias, they were kept under their rocks because it was socially unacceptable to talk that stuff. But when the President of the United States and when elected representatives like Hawley and Cruz and Rubio and Johnson and these guys start mouthing off, well, these little domesticated fuckers just sit right up and they say, yeah, that's us. They're saying go to us. When Trump says on television, stand back and stand by.
Yeah.
And people who have not connected that to January 6th are willfully ignorant. So, you know, he's a warlord. And he's got his shock troops, just like Afghanistan, just like Iraq. And America could break down into competing mafias. I mean, my guys are the Not Fucking Around Coalition. You know, the 1,000 black veterans who moved into Stone Mountain, Georgia, and called out the Boogaloo Boys and said, look at your pictures of Vietnam. We're the guys that were trained right next to you. Those guys are not going to sit around and be targets. They know what white people are up to, and they know what white people are capable of. So it's not going to be a walk in the park for the right wing and these militia boys at all. But the problem is it's going to make civilization impossible, because there are going to be enforcers in every neighborhood of both sides. It's going to be living in Northern Ireland, you know, where people that look just like you are going to be threatening you for having a black friend in the neighborhood, or having a Native American friend, or for not flying an American flag. That's what's going to happen if they win.
What do you think of President Trump has said, seemingly he thinks the good Jews are the ones that live in Israel, right? He said, American Jews, they better, you know, start supporting Israel or else it's going to be too late. He said that.
Yeah.
He said too late.
Yeah. So, you know, I don't want to say anything about him. I mean, we know who he is.
Yeah.
And 70 million Americans voted for a grifting, rapist, pussy-grabbing, porn star fucking guy to represent our nation.
Well, what's wrong with fucking a porn star?
Absolutely nothing.
Okay, let's just be clear.
I was just running a list.
Unless you had sex with a porn star while your wife is pregnant. That, I think, is what he did.
That's a little tasty, yeah.
That's a little.
But, you know, I mean, they knew who Donald Trump was. Yeah. So the more salient question is, what is it about our democratic institutions that have let 70 million people be so bitterly disappointed, who have not received the fruits of democracy and the fruits of all this fine high talk? And unless we're looking at that, we're not looking at the reason those guys became Trump's foot soldiers. But I'll just run my Stations of the Cross just to remind people.
Yeah.
Ronald Reagan becomes president. He fires 11,000 striking union air traffic controllers. He calls government the enemy. He declares war on the National Labor Relations Board. They open up right-to-work states, and they weaken the wealth-producing mechanism of the middle class. Jimmy Carter's Fed chair raises interest rates 5 points in a single day to fight inflation and bankrupts hundreds of thousands of small family farms in the Midwest. Their land is bought up by big agribusiness. Those people go to the city or they wind up as serfs. Earl Butz, Nixon's head of agriculture, told those farmers, forget your grandparents' warning, go into debt, buy big machinery, you'll be preserved by the rising land values, you don't have to worry. He was wrong. The savings and loan crisis, which came from banking deregulation, took $250 billion out of personal savings accounts and pensions. 5 people went to jail. Savings and loan officers were borrowing their clients' money as their own loans. GATT and NAFTA shipped millions and millions of jobs overseas to countries where they didn't have environmental, labor, health, and safety standards to raise prices. They knew they were going to put workers out of work, and every other industrialized country in the world retrained their workers. We spent less than any other industrialized country, and we gave our guys the opioid epidemic and the crystal meth epidemic. That's GATT and NAFTA. Then Clinton comes in. Clinton, Robert Rubin, and Larry Summers, and they shift the Democratic Party into neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is a philosophy designed to protect markets from any government intervention. That means government cannot intrude for social reasons or health reasons or environmental reasons. They cannot control markets. And what resulted from that, the ending of Glass-Steagall, which was the law that made it illegal for banks and insurance companies to speculate with your money, and the Financial Modernization Act, which made it illegal to regulate credit default swaps, was the crash of 2008, which Obama paid the tab for. Clinton took his $100 million and put it into his library, and he got away scot-free like a great elder statesman. And every year the Republicans come in, they spend the country into bankruptcy and debt. The Democrats have to come in and fix it. And it was Reagan who called that taking the toys away from the kindergartners.
Right.
And what he meant was you spend enough debt, there's no money available on social services, welfare, Medicare, daycare, so mothers can work, good roads, internet in the country.
Well, closed a lot of mental health hospitals.
Yeah. I was working in California when that happened. They closed the big holding tanks, the mental hospitals, and the plan was to open up little neighborhood centers with 5 and 10 patients so they could be supervised and get their meds. But NIMBY took over and people didn't want it in their neighborhoods, so nothing happened.
Right.
So nobody was supervising these guys not taking their meds. So I'm almost done. So my point is, both parties have betrayed urban and rural, non-college educated people for 50 years. And that, to me, is where the rage comes from. That's why people are shitting in the White House. They don't shit in the White House because they love Trump. They shit to register their disgust on a system which has abandoned them.
I'd correct you by saying I think they shit in the Capitol building. They haven't gotten to the White
Capitol
House
building.
yet.
You're right. Sorry.
They probably did. I'm sure
See,
there was.
I get hot and I get inaccurate.
I think everything you just listed, the Stations of the Cross, all of that is relevant policy thing that happened. I would argue that those are mostly conservative ideas and not progressive ideas, but they were instituted by Democrats in many cases that you just mentioned them. But we were talking about this earlier.
What do you mean? Explain what you mean. I don't follow.
Meaning what Clinton did with the deregulation of the banks.
Yeah, they were. Their neoliberalism was a strict conservative idea, but it took dominance after 50 years of Hayek and the Chicago
cutting
boys.
welfare and all of that. That was not done by Democrats in the Senate. They didn't want Clinton to do a lot of those things. It was conservative ideology that he bought into, and as a way to be more of a centrist and to get votes. So overwhelmingly, most Democrats didn't want to see those types of of cuts happening.
I think you're buying something that I'm not going to buy.
Okay.
There's an assumption that the center is the place where radical ideas from the right and the left are filtered out, and we wind up in the center, the good people, the NPR people. But in fact, the right is a spectrum of political ideas and policies. The center is a spectrum, the same, and the left is a spectrum. Well, the debate has been cut in America from the center to the right.
Right.
People call the media liberal and left, but it's just the center. And so the population never gets to hear any of the ideas which could counter neoliberalism.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about, media. But what I'm specifically referring to, and you mentioned that you had read this book, we've been talking a lot about books, was, the Politics by Winners. Paul Pearson.
Winner Take All Politics, Hatcher and Pearson.
In that book, they talk about that vote on Glass-Steagall. And I'll just never forget it because I interviewed Senator Byron Dorgan at the time, a South Dakota Democrat. He said, if we do this, in 10 years, you're going to have, and he explained what happened in almost 10 years, in 2008. He said, if we do this. So my point, the point I'm making is it was Democrats in the Senate that said we shouldn't do this, and they're on the record of saying we shouldn't do this. But no, Democratic President Bill Clinton did it.
Dorgan said it, but he got enough Democratic votes that it got to Clinton's desk and he signed it. And here's one other thing that the Democrats have not taken any responsibility for. They sat on their hands for 30 years while wages were frozen and let inflation give a demotion, a 10%, 20% loss of buying power to working people for 30 years. But because it was invisible, working people don't know it. A $7.15 an hour minimum wage is poverty, as is a $15 an hour wage. Yeah. So Democrats are sitting by and saying it's okay to work a 40-hour week, and at the end of that 40-hour week to be in poverty. And the only way you beat poverty is by having 3 jobs, which means you don't have energy for your kids, you don't have energy for your community, you don't have time to read or study the issues. The Democrats are culpable because they joined Clinton in that switch to neoliberalism.
Yeah, especially when it comes to trade, which you mentioned. And I think that's mostly right. I still think there are the ideologies, if we want to label them, that are, as you're calling, neoliberal or conservative. And then there is more progressive, or you could argue socialist even ideas, which we have obviously tenets of, plenty of. And my view is all the Stations of the Cross and all the policies and all of the blame, let's say I agree with that and it's fully accurate. I still think that it's the media, which we've talked a lot about, making so much money off of this grievance culture, and right-wing media dominates, and progressive media has a very hard time because it's more thoughtful and nuanced and policy-based. And I feel like the right-wing media is the tail that wags the dog of Republican politicians that allows them to create these policies. And the point is, you have all these people that are so mad, but they're mad about ghosts, I feel. They're mad about things that aren't happening. They were at the Capitol on January 6th because they were told that something happened, but it didn't happen. Whereas the rest of us that are in reality are mad about things that are happening, which is everything you just listed.
So there's another way to look at it. And I realize it's tarring everybody with the same brush. But if you accept my thesis that all the corporate media has shrunk the political debate between the center and the right.
Yeah.
You can say that Rachel Maddow is progressive. She's certainly smart and brilliant, but there are no ideas from the socialist edge of policy that ever make it onto MSNBC.
Bernie Sanders, AOC. What do you think of that kind of?
Bernie Sanders and AOC are angels crying in the wilderness. But because people have no idea what socialism is, I told you this morning, it's really simple. Socialism means that everything is not for sale, that the people can reserve some things for their own benefits. The people could say, yes, we like entrepreneurial capitalism, but we don't see why light, heat, power, and water should make a profit, or the post office. So let's vote for those things, that the government will run those things and the army. And then we can leave the rest out for democratic capitalism. But even there, without regulations, when Tom, who's the great quarterback, Tom Brady, dropped a couple of pounds of air from a football, there was an incredible hue and cry because people knew instinctively that if you change the rules and the norms of a game, you're ending the game. Well, Trump was ending the rules and norms of the game of America, and he's got 70 million people going along with him. You can't have a game of politics of America if you don't leave when you've lost an election.
Right.
If you violate the norms, if you stop a sitting president from getting a Supreme Court appointment. So what we're witnessing is 70 million people disenfranchised enough to say, fuck the game. I don't care about the game of America. What's it doing for me? My wife's working 3 jobs. I got a mortgage. My interest rates have gone up to 5-7%. I don't care.
But specifically, how do you explain the outrage over the idea of a public option for health insurance, or, God forbid, Medicare for all? Everybody has to get insurance. People know what it's like to be without insurance, to be worried about not having insurance. It's things like that, policies like that, where I really think it's media telling people what to think without them realizing how much better off their life would be if we had Medicare for all. It's insurance. We're not even talking about healthcare. We're just talking about being covered.
Let's nuance it just a tad.
Sure, please do.
It's media reporting what elected leaders have said without correcting them and holding them to the truth.
Right.
So they're given airtime. Look, the media, MSNBC elected Donald Trump. They had him on the air every single day. Every time he turned around, every time he farted through his mouth, they'd put him on the air and their ratings went up. And when their ratings went up, so their ad revenues went up. When their ad revenues went up, their bonuses went up. And they can be coy and chic and well-dressed and all of this stuff, but they put the motherfucker in office. And nobody stood face-to-face, toe-to-toe and said, we're not going to let you come on the public airwaves and lie. You cannot just simply tell a lie. That's not free speech. So the media hides behind neutrality of saying, well, we just report. We don't take a position.
Right.
So we've got Ron Johnson, double-digit IQ guys. They say it, we report it. So the audience of the media sees their elected leaders saying stuff, and they're not corrected. What would you think?
Even though there are plenty of fact checkers, though, in the media, but I think people don't even, they think they're, somehow on the take. Like, even if they are fact checked, people still don't, the Washington Post fact checker, well, he's a liberal, progressive or something like that. And you're just like, no, it's just, it's an objective person doing a fact check. Obama was actually born in America. Well, they don't even, when fact checked, what is it about people, their psychology, that allows them to believe a thing that is clearly not true? Because they want to believe
tribalism.
It. Right.
Right. The newspapers aligned themselves, called themselves the establishment in the 60s. And so all the institutions of expertise, of knowledge, of information that are the establishment of a system which is disenfranchised, a large portion of its population is completely mistrusted. And they may not know the facts, but they know that it doesn't all add up to them living like they should. And when you see guys like the hedge fund guys and all the people in the society charity events who are basically living for free, they've got so much money, it doesn't matter what stuff costs.
Hey.
They know, because everybody gets 1 billion ads a year, they know they're not living the good life. They know they're wearing Adidas and sweatpants and they got an old broken boat and they're watching, Jared and Fuck Pig and this one and that one, laughing and jaunty jolly. They know, but they don't know how it works. They don't know how the sausage. I was trained to run it. You were trained to run it. We know how it works. So it's easy to look at it and take it apart. These people don't know. They're not taught civics. They're not taught history. They're not taught citizenship anymore.
Well, they hate government.
Why? They hate government because government is the only institution that can hold back the corporate sector from violating their rights, violating their environment, violating their economy. And the corporate sector has used its money since the New Deal to try to unwind the New Deal and get government from diminishing its profits. And if you ask me, it's the corporate sector, which not inflation, it's corporate gouging, which is raising prices because the dollar is the strongest economy in the world.
Yeah.
How can it be when Brazil was inflated and I was working there, I got a 30% bump in my salary every week. Nobody wants to trade Brazilian money for American money. So it's not inflation. And they're bragging about it in the Wall Street Journal. They're bragging about the profits they're making. So that looks to me like the corporate sector is saying, if we make things tough enough on people, maybe we can get rid of the Democrats and we won't have these regulations to worry about. It sounds like a conspiracy, but there's no history without conspiracy. You couldn't have Julius Caesar without
It doesn't have to be a conspiracy. It just, they do what works. It works.
Yeah, it's a commonality of interests.
Get them out of the way. I mean, it's not even a conspiracy in the fact that they hire lobbyists to go influence congressmen, policymakers to create an atmosphere that allows them to make more profits and not have to pay any consequences for it.
And they have common interests and regulation that would spread some of that wealth to the average working people. You know, one of the points of neoliberalism, there's a guy by the name of, I think his name was Gary Decker. He was one of the early theorists who posited that all wages are exactly what people are worth. Even if it's not a living wage, that the market is this pure, objective entity, which gives people exactly what they're worth. And you got to remember that Milton Friedman and the Chicago boys, they went on to design the economy of Uruguay for Pinochet, who was injecting journalists with drugs and throwing them out of airplanes at 12,000 feet. These guys are totally amoral. You listen to Larry Summers, the president of Harvard, who said that women were not smart enough former president, who's saying, oh no, we got to raise unemployment much higher than 5% to slow down inflation. Really? That 5%, that raising those interest rates puts people out of work and puts every homeowner, every credit card owner, every wage slave just under a lead weight. But did they ever talk about taking tax cuts back from the wealthy people or making an equitable tax structure? These guys are just out the ass. I call them the prep school boys. They're the guys that got us into Iraq. They're the guys that wrecked Iraq. They're the guys that created the problems with Iran. We forget that we overthrew a democratically elected president in the 50s and bragged about it in the press and put the Shah in, who was a torturing pig for 35 years.
You know who doesn't forget?
The Iranians.
Yeah,
exactly. So our history starts with the capture of our diplomats.
Yeah.
But that's not where their history stops and starts. And yet, do we ever apologize? Do we ever just say, you know, we fucked up. Let's try to restart this thing so we're not at war all the time or on the verge of war? It's just crazy.
We've been talking about the world and politics and where we're going. I'm going to switch gears because I'm here visiting you because you're like a teacher and a friend to me. And I've had a really great time being here with you and just talking and seeing your space and going for a walk and eating your great bread and meditating with you, of course. Amazing. And my question to you is, you've had a lot of teachers in your life. Like, I flew out here to see you because I wanted to be around you and be connected to you. But you were telling me that the Buddhism that you practice, it's taught by a Japanese, Hiroshi
Suzuki Roshi. Roshi means senior teacher, elder.
And you never met him. You did meet him.
No, I didn't meet Suzuki Roshi.
You never met him, but what you did do for years, apparently, is you had tea with his wife.
Yeah.
So I'm sure there are plenty of other people in your life that you sought out that you wanted to be connected with. And I just wanted to ask you, here I am with you, learning from my elder and learning from a guy who I look up to and have so much respect for. what kind of people in your life have you done that with? Who's been that for you?
Well,
who's been your Peter Coyote? If you're my Peter Coyote, who's been your Peter Coyote?
Well, first and foremost, from the time I was about 2.5 or 3 to 14, I was fundamentally raised by a black family.
Right.
Susie Nelson, Susie Howard, who married her boyfriend, Ozzie Nelson.
You write about this in The Rain Man's Third Cure, if people want to read that. Yeah.
My mom had a crippling nervous breakdown, was unable to do anything. My dad was not going to stop making money. And this 17-year-old girl from Henderson, North Carolina, came into our house and just put all the troubles in a big sack and threw them over her shoulder. And my sister and I just transferred our loyalty to her. And my kitchen was full of black people all day long. And I grew up hearing them talk about white culture. And I loved them before I knew anything about color or about anything. They were safe. They took care of me. They paid attention to me. I loved them. Those were my first great teachers. Then my dad had a best friend who was a bebop bass player, who was Charlie Parker's roommate in Kansas City and came to New York. He was from Hope, Arkansas, and Virginia Clinton, Bill Clinton's mother, was his classmate. They shared a desk. And he taught me about living life on the one as an improviser. I mean, just not repeating. And he was high every day of his life from the time he was 17 years old. He was the only guy in Hope. He worked at an undertaker's who would serve black funerals, take care of the bodies. And anyway, a great lesson from him. And then the manager of my farm, my dad's ranch, was an ex-game warden who hunted Italian guys who were killing the egrets in Florida to get their feathers for hats in New York. And he was an environmentalist. He taught me how to fish and how to trap. And he was kind of one of those Scotch-Irish handsome guys, you know, close-lipped, clean-jawed. And I just admired the hell out of him. And then when I started reading about the beats when I was about 14, and I had all these kind of nascent ideas about what was not working. People forget, you know, there were just as many PTSD cases coming back from World War II as Vietnam and as Iraq, but they were never talked about. And the country was awash in alcohol and rages and crazy shit. And the Beats were the first grown-ups that I ever read that were talking about it. And all the Beats were looking at this guy, Gary Snyder. And when I got to college, I was in the black turtleneck sweater, Camel cigarette crowd, and we were all poets. And of my group, 3 out of the 5 of us became writers. And Gary Snyder was this guy. And when I got out of college, shortly after that, I met Gary Snyder. And Gary had lived 9 years in Japan in a Japanese monastery. He had taken some kind of vows, and he came up to the Sierras and he taught a bunch of young kids how to cut down the trees and build a beautiful log house on his land. And he became kind of the core of a community up there of people who were kind of Buddhists, but secular Buddhists, not monastic Buddhists. And he was the first person that really showed me what a life dedicated to Buddhist principles could look like in American vernacular.
How old were you about this time?
I was about 25, 26. And so when the counterculture ended, I had about a 10-year run of heroin that kind of knocked me out a little bit. And when I had to clean up and straighten out, I was a single father of a daughter. I was going with a girl who was sitting at San Francisco Zen Center. And that's a Zen monastery in San Francisco. And I started joining her. And I was just like a ball of barbed wire. I thought they were all uptight and idiots, and I was already enlightened, and I was just going to get a little Zen polish on the surface. Anyway, little by little, I slowed down, and I started to look around. And so I did 8 years there. I was living across the street, but I was there every day. And then I moved out to Mill Valley when my daughter was getting mugged for her lunch money. And after a number of years, I met another guy from Zen Center who had quit. There had been a scandal with the head teacher at Zen Center, the guy that took over after Suzuki Roshi died. And there was a scandal, sex scandal. He had a zipper problem. And community got messed up a little bit. And my teacher left and started a business, and then about a dozen years later came back and finished his training and got transmitted. And I started working with him, and that was a good fit. He was also a secular guy. And then I think around 2009, he ordained me as a priest. And I think around 2012 or maybe 14, he transmitted me, which is, they stick a meat thermometer in you and it says you're done. And the phrase is, your eyebrows are tangled with Buddha's eyebrows. And so at that point, I'm free to ordain my own priests and start my own lineage. And I have about 8 students that I work with. I don't want more than that, not at my age anyway. And I'm kind of moving them up the ladder. And we meet on Zoom. I mean, one of them's in Atlanta, one of them's in Florida, one's in New York, a couple in Berkeley. And I like working with them. But eventually, one of the people I've ordained, I'll transmit, and then I'll retire. I'll let somebody else do it, and because I'd rather concentrate on my writing.
What is, when you say secular, what do you mean?
Well, so there's monastic practice. So, there's no difference in the practice between an ordinary student and a priest. But a priest is an archetype, and it's sort of a special person that's willing to be at service, willing to fill needs as they come up. It's not better than, it's just some people can do it, some people can't. When my teacher asked me to take a priest training, I said, well, I'll never become a priest, so I'm not doing that. He said, no, just do the training. You'll learn a lot. And the truth was, I was so impressed by the people that were in the class, about 40 of them, that I just wanted to up my game. And when it was over, it was a 3-year training. When it was over, I said I'd like to be ordained, and he did. And so, I've had a couple missteps. One person I ordained didn't work out so well, and another guy I was going to ordain, I decided not to. I decided he didn't really want to be a priest. But the other guy that I've ordained is perfect, and I'll eventually transmit him. So secular just means that you're out in the world. You have a family, you have a wife, you have a job, and you're dealing with all the problems of ordinary people. And you're dealing with them through the prism of Buddhist understanding and meditating and the understanding that that thing you refer to as a self doesn't actually exist as a separate entity from the universe. And meditating will reinforce that knowledge to you. I mean, I can tell you in 60 seconds, you've never been independent of oxygen or water or microbes in the soil or sunlight or pollinating insects or birds. So I can take it all the way out to the Earth's place in space. If we were closer to the sun, water would boil off. If we were farther away, it would freeze. We wouldn't be here. And the Earth is held in place by all the gravitational forces of the universe. So that thing we call a self, which we think of as a separate entity from the rest, actually isn't. Because there is no self without sunlight, without water, without oxygen, without stuff. So, yes, we all have self-awareness. We all have proprioception of this body we inhabit. But the ancient Chinese used to call that awareness the host, because that's always home. The body is the guest. The guest comes and goes. Now, if the host doesn't have a guest, there's no way they can move through the world. You can't move through the world without a nervous system of something that separates you from everything, even if it's a fiction. And if there's no host, you have no idea of a spiritual dimension. So the two go together. So a secular life means you're just in the world like everyone else, but you understand things about the world that Buddhists understand.
One of the things that you have an understanding of is death and what it means. And I hope you won't mind me saying, but I know you just found out that someone that you've been close to almost your whole life has just passed, and you did a dedication this morning, which I thought was just so interesting and original and enlightening, and really felt good to be a part of, even though I didn't know this woman. You do this for anybody who
asks.
Anybody. Well, my question is, what was that, and what are some of the things that you say? Because I wanted you to share some of that routine about.
Well, so this girl was maybe the first girl I ever kissed. 10 years old. She was a friend of my family's. She's a beautiful, wonderful woman named Ellen Levine, and she was a disciple of Helen Gurley Brown. She became a serious C-suite member of the Hearst Corporation. She created Oprah's TV channel.
Big magazine executive.
Yeah, big time.
One of the first women to ever, I looked her up, be the editor-in-chief of, I think, Good Housekeeping.
Yeah, Bridal magazine, did all this stuff. And she was a big big Democratic fundraiser. Mm-hmm. And she was just this incredibly loyal friend. We stayed really close. And when my first book came out, she held a big party for me in the Hearst offices, invited all sorts of media celebrities and stuff. And I showed you that little article she wrote in one of the magazines. My boyfriend became a movie star. Anyway, a couple of years ago, she got dementia. And I have to say the Hearst Corporation was so great to her. They kept her office. They kept her salary. They kept her secretary. She would come in. She didn't know what was going on. And so I just found out yesterday she died because her sons called me. And so here's an image that I tell people at funerals. Grief is the cost of loving. If you get attached to somebody, you're going to grieve when they die. And there's nothing wrong with it. It doesn't mean that you're spiritually immature. What you should do is honor it and burn it out. If you have to cry for a week, cry for a week. It doesn't matter. Don't lock it in your muscles. Don't deny it. Denying it is like working out with a weight. When you stress it, it builds a bigger muscle. So you let it go. But once people can accept their grief, then I say, imagine you're on a cliff overlooking an ocean that's filled with little spiky waves, not big rollers, little wavelets. Well, every one of those wavelets could be a nameable thing in the universe. Could be a human being, could be a hummingbird, could be an ocelot, could be a species, could be a mountain range, could be anything. And what they have in common is they rise up into form for a while. They hang around in the duration of their own time. A mayfly for 24 hours, human being for 70 or 80 years, an elephant for 100 and something. And then they go back into the ocean. And we tend to divide it up, and we tend to say when it's a wave, it's alive. And when it falls back into the ocean, we say it's dead. But what we forget, and what those little wavelets forget, is that it's never not been part of the ocean. And neither have we never not been part of all of it. And so the apparent singularity of our existence is only one half of the equation. The other half is that we're all like ticks on the body of a dog. We're all part of a much bigger thing. And if you only look at the separate part, you're leaving out the whole other important part of the equation. That's why it's so easy to judge people and get angry at people, because you forget you're made of the same stuff they are. I'm made of what Donald Trump is made out of. There's no way around it. And we've had different experiences and different life choices and stuff. And I don't have to condone what he does, but I can't pretend that I have any more right to existence than he does. And since we're both here together, I have to figure out some way to deal with it. So the Tibetans, a lot of people have ideas about reincarnation. So Buddha didn't really teach reincarnation. Buddhism developed in India in a Hindu culture, which had a lot of stuff about lifetimes and the self, the Atman, the soul, body hopping, jumping from body to body. And Buddha gave it a certain amount of lip service, but you don't have to understand anything about reincarnation to understand Buddhism. And more deeply you go in Buddhism, you realize that the first principle is that nothing exists by itself. Nothing. No sunlight, no apple tree. No apple tree, no apple. No apple, no seed. No pollinating insects, no apple tree. No water, no apple tree. So if that's the case, to posit the idea of a permanent soul is just a comfort to the ego, which can't really imagine its own disappearance. Because no body, no soul, no thoughts, no soul, no impulses, no soul, no consciousness, no soul. So it's fine for the Abrahamic religions, which are all dualities. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. They all have a God of good and a God of evil, the devil, right? And if you look at the devil carefully, he's nature. He's got furry hindquarters, he's got hooves, he's got horns, he's got a tail, he's got fangs. Well, only a sky god religion would make nature the enemy. The 30,000-year continuance of feminine worshiping, female worshiping religion, which went through the Paleolithic and the Neolithic up until about 2000 BC, the longest religion on earth, knew that women were the creative, generative force, and they honored it. And of course, they honored the sacred bull as well, but it was not a domination culture. So a domination culture, which is what we live in, which is male-dominated cultures, are always based on fear and always based on avoiding pain or avoiding death. And so if you think of death as the extinction of everything, of this little isolated thing you are, well, of course, it's going to be terrifying and terrible. But if you realize, well, wait a minute, even if I disappear, the sun's going to rise. The birds are going to sing. It's going to rain. The trees are going to bloom. Everything's going to go on. This body's not going to go on. This temporary snowflake of an existence of mine. But what is it? It's all of this. So if you put your attention on what's not dying, it bolsters you a lot more than if you focus your concentration so tightly on this body which is going to go, or the idea that your awareness is going to go. Because you can't really imagine it.
We were talking earlier. What was it you were telling me about you pick up a speck?
Oh, yeah.
That? I love that.
The speck of dust, Fuketsu's speck of dust. So there's a Zen's full of these little riddles called koans, you know. There's a boat sailing in the harbor, stop it. What's the sound of one hand clapping? They're things that can't be understood intellectually or logically. And there's my favorite one is one by a 12th century Zen master called Fuketsu. And what he said was, if you pick up one speck of dust, the nation prospers. If you don't pick it up, nothing happens. And then he goes on to explain, doing anything is a speck of dust. Building a Zen monastery that's going to take a century. Next to the immensity of the universe, it's a speck of dust. Planting a forest, saving the last whale, civil rights, whatever it is, whatever you choose to do. If you're a person who feels like you have to act, you're going to pick up the speck of dust. There are people who are not bothered by anything they see. They're not bothered by the suffering of others, so they don't pick up the speck of dust. So nothing happens. But the important thing about this koan is that when you pick up the speck of dust, you pick up the whole world. You don't pick up just the good you think you're doing. That's the part that most people miss. You pick up the whole world. You pick up all the good and all the evil. And so for everything that you do, there'll be as much that you do that's negative, that you didn't intend, that comes along with it. So for all the prep school boys, you know, that come out with these simple things, yeah, we're going to invade Iraq. We're going to just take the oil. It'll pay for it. It'll be over in 3 days. Oops. We never thought about IEDs. Oops. We never thought about warlords and mafias. Oops. We never thought about pallets of cash, you know, and what that would do to a culture. We never thought that people might be pissed off that we weren't protecting the libraries and the operas. We might never figured if we fire the entire army and reduce them to unemployment and leave them their weapons, they really have no stake in joining us, do they? So they don't see that. They're just looking at the good that they're doing. And so that's like a kind of immature, childish kind of mind who doesn't really know how the world operates. If you know how the world operates, it means you're always cautious. You do something, you stop and check. Is the situation still the same?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll do it again.
You did the fox.
Yeah, it's like a fox. He comes into a field, he stops, he looks around, he checks, he takes a couple little steps, he stops and he checks again. Even a wolf, when it's running away from you, it stops and turns and looks back. They always check. We don't do that.
What do we do?
Yeah, we get an idea. We say, this is a good thing to do.
Yeah.
Let's go after it. And we just go wholeheartedly, and we don't check because we're so convinced of the good that we're doing that we don't see that we're dragging a wagon full of negative consequences along with it.
I wanted to ask you one more question I think we've never talked about, which is just kind of hierarchy in whether it be in employment or family or what have you, where there are the bosses. You know, we've been talking a lot about the Lincoln Project, which you've done voiceovers for, and we watched you watched the Showtime documentary series about it, and we watched this final episode, and you made comment about it there. You've been on plenty of movie sets throughout your career. What are your thoughts and views on just kind of a workplace hierarchy, and what's wrong with that?
Well, it's not necessarily that there's anything wrong with that. In any given job, there's somebody who's best at it. And when we lived on the communes, we learned pretty early that if we were going to build a sewer, there was some guy who was going to understand it better than everybody else. And if we just followed them, him or her, for that job, and everybody fell in line behind their authority, everything would go great. And then when the job was over, their authority was over. So it's not the hierarchy, it's the freezing of a hierarchy. And it's the freezing of the status and the authority and the power. So the irony about business is that any kind of behavior is tolerated if it makes a profit. That's true in the movies. That's true in corporate life. I mean, people can behave execrably. It's just staggering. And people will follow them. So what bothered me about the Lincoln Project, which was such a heroic group project of these wonderful young kids crunching data and these older political hands showing them how to use it and apply it and turn them into ads. They were all engaged in this great effort. But there were some human failings at work too, like the four principals who were doing the appearances on television and representing the face of the agency. Well, money was going to their little subset private corporations, and it wasn't really transparent how and why it was being spent. And the New Yorker ran a big article about them and left out the little political room, all the college kids doing this brilliant brainstorming on the computers, and that built resentment. And so then after the election, the principals had a pad, they had a base, they had an identity, and they could move on. And they could separate themselves from the younger people. But by doing that, they missed the opportunity to train them. They missed the opportunity to give them the real transfer of their skill sets. They just turned them loose into the marketplace. So for me, those are incidents of absorbing the lessons of capitalism as if they were universal truths. You know, it's not necessary. My gang in the 60s was called the Diggers. We were famous for the first free medical clinics, the first free stores, feeding 600 people every day for nothing. And there's 108 of us still left, and we all chip in every month. And we support 15 or 20 people who are just old and infirm and poor, and they're getting $600 or $700 a month Social Security. We're able to give them another $200. So to me, it was sad because I like these guys. I mean, I loved working with Rick Wilson, but the fact that he couldn't see that his eminence was built by all these people, this whole team. Yeah, okay, maybe he was the general, but, you know, didn't he have a cook? Didn't he have an armorer? Didn't he have a foot soldier? Bertolt Brecht wrote a poem like that. Didn't Napoleon have a cook? So to me, it was quite sad because when this battle was over temporarily and Trump lost the election, you had this extraordinary enterprise. But people said, well, I don't want to work with him anymore. I want to do this. And, so 4 people got away, really kind of set up, famous, had more money than the others, and they just cut them loose because they didn't need them. And that to me was a reiteration of the worst of capitalism, utilitarian comradeship. I'm with you as long as I need you, as long as you're good to me. No loyalty, no institutionalism. And when this little task is done, we're over. That's not the way human beings have evolved.
All right. Well, we've been talking for an hour, and I asked you earlier if you would play something for me, and you said you would.
Oh, my goodness.
How do you feel about that now?
I think I have no voice left. Hold it. Can we put a pause on this while I look for my guitar?
Yep.
This is a really old song from when I was living in my truck and traveling around in the desert. So it's called Dead End. Nighttime and I'm back on the highway. Truck stops bathed in neon as I pass. It's the witching hour on a made my baby cry day. And I'm wondering as I'm driving, was I straight or was I jiving? What about our conversation had me pulling out so fast? As I drive on through the night toward some far-off twinkling lights, this old highway's become my life, with all its twists and bends. Keep my eyes alert and ready. I like to keep my senses steady, 'cause you never know just when your road dead ends. All the towns far below are gently sleeping. I coast by too invisible to offend. It's a funny day, but somehow I feel like weeping as that nighttime disc jockey gets to rapping quick and cocky to people calling in, sending records to their friends. As I drive on through the night toward some far-off twinkling lights, this old highway's become my life, and you can't make amends. I keep my eyes alert and ready. I like to keep my senses steady. You never know just when your road dead ends. Well, it seems somehow we've lost the knack of speaking. Silence sits beside me like a bone. I don't know where I'm going or what it is I'm seeking. A conversation would be in order, but I have no friends at this border. I would stop to call, but there's skeletons in the phone. As I drive on through the night towards some far-off twinkling lights, this old highway's become my life, with all its twists and bends. I keep my eyes alert and ready. I like to keep my senses steady, 'cause you never know just when your road dead ends. I
say you never know just when your road dead end. I say you never know just when your road dead end.
All right, there you go, everybody. Peter Coyote in his own home. What just a magical, unforgettable trip. I hope I get to go back. I learned so much in such a short amount of time, including just how to host somebody and make them feel comfortable and how to treat people. I saw him take, 4 or 5 calls from folks, and just the way that he talks to them and shows interest in them. I loved it, and I want to emulate him in so many ways. And he's a bad, bad man, Peter Coyote, as well as a Buddhist priest. So a lot to learn from him, and I hope he lives forever. And I am so, so grateful that he let me do that. Let me stay at his house. Let me tape that interview. I think he had a good time, too. I'm sure of it. All right. Also, thanks again to my buddies, the San Francisco boys out there in California. I had such a great time with Jim and Joby, Pete and Dustin. Really was a special, special time, and I hope that they're all still listening to this. Tomorrow, I'll be back with the midterm election erection special. What? I am looking forward to recapping with some of our favorite guests, short bursts, 10 minutes or so, with 6 or 7 or more. I don't know how many people I'll get on. Maybe it won't be that many. We'll see. But it'll be great. Looking forward to bringing you that tomorrow and seeing you have to hang out, telling you more about this trip. Hopefully some of the San Fran boys will be there joining us. You know, Pete Co. usually stops by. So thank you all very much. So grateful to you. I hope that you will, if you haven't already, consider a paid subscription to the podcast, because while it's free, it isn't cheap. I put a lot into it, including this trip, where I learned so much and gained so much, and I appreciate you letting me have a few days off, too. All right, I'll talk to you tomorrow.
Stand our ground, and then stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't in sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it is time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. Alright, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.